This is a CBC podcast.
Tanse, Anine, Boujou, hello and welcome. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Rosanna Dearchild. Losing someone can be a great challenge in any community. But in Indigenous communities, many circumstances can make the grieving process especially difficult. Today on Unreserved, we're exploring grief, death, and dying in Indigenous communities. You'll hear how some deal with heavy losses and how others are focused on the need for promotion of vibrant Indigenous life. Life expectancy for Indigenous people in Canada is lower than the rest of the country's population. Part of the reason is the higher rates of sudden deaths in Indigenous communities. Jeffrey Anslus has worked to try to understand the issues behind that statistic. Jeffrey is Cree and is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. He's here to talk about some of his research into death and dying within Indigenous communities. Hello, Jeffrey.
Thanks for having me.
So how is grieving and death in Indigenous communities different than others?
Well, I think death and dying in any community can look different to begin with. Every family, every person has different traditions and different ways of expressing grief. And it's certainly true that culture really shapes our sense of what normal grieving is. And so for as much diversity as there is within Indigenous communities across the country, there are as many expressions of grief that surround issues of death and dying.
What are some of the issues that Indigenous communities are dealing with?
Well, there's often the sort of typical things that go along with an experience of loss of a family member or a loved one. But for many Indigenous communities, this is complicated by the nature of how people have died. For a lot of families experiencing sudden loss, and in particular unexpected loss through homicides or suicides, it can be particularly difficult to think about what grieving might look like in that context.
So, Jeffrey, what are some of the things that Indigenous communities do as part of their grieving process? I mean, for example, in my community, there's a 4-day grieving process before we send that person off in a number of different ceremonies and things that are rooted in culture. What have you seen?
There's often a grieving process between the point when a person passes and when they pass on towards a spirit world. And that can be kind of mitigated by a number of different ceremonies. In my community, that's often the lighting of a fire that stays lit for the entire period of those days. In other communities, that might mean we speak of that person during that time, but then after that period has ended, we may not actually speak of or use that person's name for a period of time. Other communities, have specific medicines that are used to help ease that transition between death and the spirit world. There are a lot of different traditions, but those are, I guess, just a few that come to mind.
Mm-hmm. So how has the grieving process changed in Indigenous communities?
That's an interesting question. I would say, it's changed substantially over the course of the experience of colonization. If you look at this from a historical lens, our communities and our cultures had intact practices around death and dying that predate sort of the ways in which we approach these issues today throughout Canada. And so, those things changed in large part due to the impact of colonization and the effects of largely missionary movements throughout Indigenous communities and then more recently residential schools. And I think the other thing that's also true is there's other factors that are causing these traditions to change. One being we have to think about how to create and how to respond to the unexpected and unprecedented loss of life due to unexpected death, things like homicide and suicide, the ways that murders or missing people or the loss of young ones in our community. We may not have had a script for how to deal with those things. And so in those senses, we have to create new traditions and protocols to take care of people in new contexts. The other thing is that a lot of people live far from their communities. I, for example, live in Toronto, and my home community is in Fisher River, Manitoba. And so thinking about how do you take care, how do you create ceremonies to support grieving, how do you create community connection when a lot of people live in substantial distance from their communities and from the context by which they might be informed by traditional practices around death and dying.
Mm-hmm. Now, I understand that in many communities that often, as you said, there are a lot of sudden death issues, whether that's suicide or whether that is homicide, or when somebody goes missing and you don't have that opportunity to grieve over a body per se.
Mm-hmm.
What does this cycle do? How does that affect a community when you've just finished grieving somebody and then somebody else passes?
Well, I think it's profoundly painful for a community, and a community is often never not in a season of grieving. Mm-hmm. I don't want to give the impression that every community, every Indigenous community is the same in that regard, but there are communities throughout Canada where Indigenous people are never living outside of the shadow of that type of loss. Mm-hmm. And I think that creates tremendously difficult circumstances where people are often confronted by their own pain on a daily basis, and where there's never a reprieve from that type of loss. The impacts of that can be really detrimental on people's sense of well-being, their health, and certainly has other impacts in communities as well. People's ability to be engaged in school or work, or other impacts are really felt that can be quite systemic for a community.
Certainly. Now, you've said that media, government, and people in general often conflate sudden deaths in our communities to mental health issues, which seems very simplistic, but you think it's more deep-rooted than that. How so?
Yeah, I think, it's certainly true that, if you look at issues like suicide, there's no debate that there are aspects of health that are intertwined with that experience. But I do think it's more complicated than that, and I think that the way in which the issue is treated is often quite simplistic. The fact is that to live a good life, you need conditions that are conducive to living. And when we look at the contexts across Canada where suicides, for example, are most prominent, these are often contexts where there has been ongoing diminishment of the quality of life for Indigenous people. So it shouldn't surprise us that communities that experience the highest degrees of economic disparity are often the same types of contexts where suicide is more prevalent. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, there's all these other factors that kind of surround a person that are not just about them as people and their particular vulnerability or risk towards, let's say, something like depression, but also it's to take into consideration the host of factors that exist around a person in their environment, these different points of contact that shape whether something like suicide makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your work, you talk about promoting vibrant Indigenous life. What does that mean, and what does it look like?
Well, I think that it's one thing to save people from death. Yeah. But I think that, to a certain degree, if that's the limit of our vision, or if that's the end of what we hope for, I think it's a pretty low bar. I think we have to answer the question of why is life worth sticking around for? If we can begin to answer that question with young people in our communities, I think we shift towards things that create conditions for a good life. And every community has different ways of talking about this. But I think a good life, in our community is certainly one where you can experience joy, where your basic needs are met. In the big picture, we need our federal government in collaboration with provincial and municipal and territorial and First Nations governments to really begin to think about suicide prevention in a completely different way. One that is not entirely preoccupied with crisis response, this sort of revolving door of social workers or psychiatric nurses into communities after a crisis has already happened, but to really make good on the commitment to really do justice by Indigenous people by ensuring that their conditions for living are at the very minimum equal to that of other Canadians. But a higher bar than that are conducive for a good life. I think that means that communities where, where there's chronic underfunding for infrastructure or underfunding for education or underfunding for healthcare, really has to be taken seriously as part of the constellation of issues that shape young people's desires to want to live. So that's on the big picture. I think that's where we need to start. I think on the more day-to-day, everyday, like who we are as people in relationship with one another and in relationship with other Indigenous people in our country, I think we have to be really mindful of not just always cracking it up to this person is sick, this person is mentally ill. While that may be true, and we need to think about creating more accessible services or more accessible healthcare, that's not the only thing we have to pay attention to. We have to think about our responsibilities to create kinder societies where people feel like their lives are actually valued.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Kinasknamitna.
Good, thank you.
That's Jeffrey Anslus, an assistant professor at the University of Toronto who specializes in the intersections of psychology, society, and culture with Indigenous studies. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. A warning about our next story. It has some disturbing details and language. After 4 of Mason Buffalo's cousins died by suicide, he dedicated his life to helping others. The man from Musquechies, Alberta, says while everybody's been hurt in his community, he wants to give them hope again. The CBC's Roberta Bell has that story.
Mason Buffalo puts the headstone at the base of the white cross that marks his cousin's grave.
Oh yeah, I'm just getting emotional doing this, man. Because it was just her birthday the other day.
He maintains the Sampson Cemetery in Musquechies, where she's buried, alongside 3 of their other cousins, who all committed suicide before they turned 30.
Look at all my family here that took their own life, right? It's easy for me to just go don't want to swear, but it's easy for me to just go string up and just give up on everything. But I don't want to be that guy. I want to show people that there's hope in our community.
He says his life is like many people's in his community. He's struggled as a teen parent, on the front line as a young firefighter, with alcohol, with mental health, and with loss. In a community of 16,000 people, he says it's surprisingly easy to feel alone. That's why he's dedicated himself to being there for others, in person and in spirit.
If I wasn't doing what I'm doing right now, then I probably wouldn't be here. I'd probably be buried in this graveyard. And that's my truth. Guaranteed, I probably would have been here right now if I didn't start helping other people.
This is his story. Mason walks through the field behind his dad's 2-story farmhouse, where he grew up on the Sampson Cree Nation in Musquechies.
Just let him in and close that gate behind him.
His dad, Patrick Buffalo, is a rancher and a hypnotherapist and Reiki master.
The reference point for most people is the past and their experiences. That's where they're stuck, is in their memories.
After Mason became a dad himself at 15, he took a job with the fire department.
Working as a fire department, you don't know what call you're going on.
On his first day, the very first call that came in was about his cousin Farron. 3 years later, it was his cousin Tyrell.
Seeing my first cousin like that, lifeless, that's how it all started. From there, that's when my life went downhill fast for 1 full year. That's when I didn't want to live no more.
Mason left Musquechies for Toronto. That's where he was when his dad called him and told him his cousin Cody had died by suicide.
I didn't even have time to come back and pay my last respects for Cody. And it's tough. Especially for our people with what we're going through. And it's like, someone has to step up and take the lead, right?
So he came home. If you ask him to describe himself now, he says suicide awareness advocate.
If I thought about my life and what my plans were and everything like that, I didn't think I'd be doing what I'm doing right now.
When he got back, he started his first of many community initiatives, Walking in Spirit.
So what the elders say is like, when you commit suicide, is like that you're going to be lingering around this area till it's your time to go. So it's like you're lost, right? Your spirit's lost.
People from all 4 of the nations that make up Maskwacis now set aside a day every year to walk the reserve's rural roads, carrying handmade signs and mementos, wearing shirts with the names of their late loved ones written across their chests.
My heart breaks into a million pieces. Each day I'm picking up these pieces and getting my heart back together. And helping people helps me.
Mason says the number of suicides look like they've gone down, at least in Samson. For him, the work is year-long and a part of everything he does. This team of horses at his father's ranch makes frequent trips to the cemetery.
Sometimes there's like 3 funerals we're doing within a week.
They pull a hearse with big spoked wheels and light pink curtain toppers with tassels hanging from the top of the glass window on every side. It was an idea that Mason and his dad had to give community members that last ride. That's not all the horses do, though. They're also helping people to heal. Nestled in the snow-coated trees to the east of Patrick's barn is another project with his son.
Mason came back, and then he started making paths and clearing the bush, and we bought a cabin, set up a teepee.
They call it Mostosame Village. It's a place where people visit to confront their trauma.
Going for a ride in a wagon with a team of horses is very therapeutic. It's very healing. Going for a horseback ride is very therapeutic. So that's what we offer here is an experience. It's so peaceful there. It's like being somewhere else, you know.
Patrick says his son needs to be doing this work for his own well-being and for others.
So Mason does have a strong vision for healing, although he struggles in his own ways continuously, you know, because he's had his own experiences ever since he was a child that he has to continue to deal with. And it's no different, you know, with the 16,000 people that live in this community. You know, everybody's been hurt. You know, everybody's stuck in a rut, not knowing how to get unstuck. He knows what he needs to do. And when he's doing it, yes, I feel good. Okay, when we can work as a team, I feel good. Okay, but it's a choice. Everything is a choice.
Mason is sitting on the porch step of the ranch house, scrolling on an iPhone. His unofficial job is never done. He says he gets a lot of messages from people in the community who are struggling just like he was, just like he still is some days.
They reach out to me, I help them out. They don't trust other people.
Stacey Rain has been friends with Mason since high school. Earlier this year, when she was dealing with the death of her mother, her nephew was killed.
I messaged him right away, and I told him what was going on. He's always there, like, for everybody. You have no idea how many people have him to rely on. Like, it's just a gift he was given, I guess.
Mason stands alone in the teepee in his dad's field. The sun breaks through the gray clouds and shines down on him, symbolic of the inner turmoil he says he constantly battles.
Question myself, why do I go out there and try to help other people? That's the hardest question I ask myself.
He's stronger than he gives himself credit for sometimes, and deep down, he has the answer.
What keeps me going is just like, if I know I helped one person save their life, then that helps me.
Thanks to the CBC's Roberta Bell for sharing that story. If you or someone you know needs any help or resources, visit our website, cbc.ca/unreserved. Still to come, a bright light in the dark discussion of suicide in Indigenous communities.
One thing that this job has given me in the last 2 years that I didn't ever anticipate was hundreds of amazing youth that connect to me and call me Auntie or Mama Bear. They have someone that they can come talk to.
Find out how We Matter is reaching out to kids. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169 and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. A doula is someone who supports another person through a significant health-related event, the most common being a birth doula. But there's another kind of doula, a death doula. They help people through the end-of-life transition. Mike Kelly is an elder from the Shwahamel First Nation, and he is a death doula. He joins me from Vancouver. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you. It's a wonderful trip down here in this calming weather.
So this is a field that I've never heard of before. Can you tell me what a death doula does?
We as First Nations people, we've been doing it for, well, myself, I've been doing it for almost half of my life already, to help the people cross over back into the spirit world.
Right. And how do you do that?
Through prayer and encouragement and just making sure that they're comfortable with the prayers. They always 100% feel better after prayer and a few words.
So how did you get into this field of work?
Back in the 70s here when I changed my life into a Christian life and started from there just doing funerals, and then after that I was asked to go pray with the people on their deathbeds in hospitals, and then it just transpired from there.
So how do you incorporate your First Nation culture into your practice as a death doula?
It's pretty similar to what a death doula does today. I go in and talk to the family and make sure that I can go in and talk to the loved one that's laying there and pray with them, talk to them, encourage them, that there's life after death and stuff like that, and help them to let go of their fear and doubt and what's going to happen to them after they leave this physical plane.
Is there a kind of ceremony that you take people through?
Everything we do with prayer and encouraging is ceremony. I mean, that's what I call it anyways. I talk to them and I pray with them, and sometimes I do the hands-on healing, kind of similar to Reiki. So we do that kind of work too, and that alleviates a lot of the pain and fear that they have. After I get done praying with them and encouraging them, they always say, "Boy, I feel better. I'm not so afraid to die now." It's all positive encouragement and a prayer, and offering where they're going is a good place, to after they leave this physical plane of life.
So when you're taking people through this process, what kinds of things do you tell them to ease their pain or ease their grief?
They're going to a place where there's no more pain, no more sorrow. All of the Christians, they call them angels, and us as Native people, we call them ancestors. And we meet all of our ancestors on the other side, and they're singing and dancing while we're over here on this side mourning and weeping, because it's sometimes when we lose an important person on this side, it's a really big loss.
For sure. This must be very difficult work to be doing. What kinds of self-care do you practice to make sure that you're okay?
We have what we call a 1910 Indian Shaker Church, and we do prayers and hands-on healing brushings in there. I have a sweat lodge that I go and pray in the sweat lodge, and downtown we have a sauna where we go in there and we use our medicines and use our prayers in there, and to lighten the load off of our own selves, our mind, our heart, and our body.
Why do you think that this kind of work is important?
This work is very, very, very important because a lot of our people that we've turned to a different culture than our own, and a lot of our people don't know our culture, and all they know is you're going to go to hell or you're going to go to heaven. To encourage them, that there's a place of peace on the other side. It's not everything what man says it is.
Right. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
That was Mike Kelly, an elder from the Shwahamel First Nation. He is a death doula. You're listening to Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. The hardest part of being from a northern Indigenous community is all the deaths. That's the title of an op-ed that Inuk journalist Ozzie Michelin wrote for CBC Indigenous last February. In the article, he writes about the lower life expectancy of Inuit and the high suicide rates of his home province, Labrador, and how one grieves again and again, and in his case, from afar. Ozzie is from Northwest River in Labrador, but we've reached him in Montreal. Hi, Ozzie.
Hi, Rosanna.
So tell me, what inspired you to write this op-ed?
Well, actually, it was about a year ago this time. I had gone to the community of Nain with some work and was visiting some friends, a dear friend of mine. And after hearing about him for years and years, I met her fiancé. And 6 days later, George tragically died in a snowmobiling accident. And Nain had been going through a lot of deaths at that time. And it just really made me think back to growing up in Labrador, that it always seemed like a particular community would be hit with death after death. It just felt like death hung in the air. And then it would go away for a while and it would move on to another place. And it just felt like it was Nain's turn. And after seeing this in so many places in Labrador over so many years, it just made me want to talk about it. And I think it really connected with a lot of people living in northern communities, because it's not just Labrador, it's all across the north.
Why do you think experiencing death in a northern community is so much more difficult?
Well, it's because we all have very large extended families from very small towns. So our connections and our relationships, they run very wide. We're all like 1 degree of separation, if that even. And with this, anything that happens, you hear about it. And even if you don't know the person, we all live the same lifestyle, and it can happen to any one of us, and we really feel it. There was a tragic boating accident that happened this past summer in the community of Rigolet, and together, just strangers put together a fundraiser and raised the family who had lost a husband and a wife thousands and thousands of dollars to help support the family for transportation and costs, because dying in the north is expensive.
In your experience, how do northern communities handle grief?
Well, this is actually the silver lining to it, the beauty in it, is that we're really good at coming together and supporting each other and putting things aside when there's a tragedy. And it's a shame that we have to do this so often, but at least this is the times when you see us, at our best, helping each other.
It must be difficult for you as someone who lives in Montreal now. When someone dies in your community, how do you grieve from afar?
Yeah, it's always kind of a strange situation to be in. You feel really alone. You spend a lot of time on Facebook looking at pictures and messaging people, phone calls with parents and friends, just checking in, seeing what's going on, trying to stay up to date, and also connecting with other people that are far away and saying, do you hear what's going on at home? And just kind of, that feeling of trying to at least connect with somebody. And sometimes, the internet has made it a lot better because we can now see pictures and videos from far away, but before that it was even more difficult.
Very isolating, I imagine.
Yeah, but but you have to realize that you're not alone in this, and there's other people far away that are affected, and you can talk to them and really connect with them and support each other.
Now, Ozzie, as you mentioned, social media has really changed how we grieve, but do you think it's made it easier or more difficult as somebody who may not be able to get home for that?
Yeah, social media has definitely changed the way that we grieve in the north. in some ways it's bad because the families that are grieving can sometimes get inundated with people wanting to know what happened or wanting to see how that they can help, and the families just want some privacy at the time. Mm-hmm. But then also at the same time, for those of us that can't physically be there, it's a way for us to watch and feel like we're there. Sometimes it might even make us feel a little bit further away, but at the very least we can sort of participate in our own way, even if it is kind of shallow.
In spite of all the untimely deaths in northern communities, they still continue to survive and thrive. What do you think that says about Inuit and about Indigenous people in general?
Well, I think that our lives have not always been easy. We know what it's like to live through hardships, and that has helped to make people very empathetic when it comes to things like this. It's our reflex to reach out and help. Mm-hmm. And this helping of each other, it's what kept us alive in the past, it's what kept our ancestors alive, and it's what's keeping us alive right now.
Mm-hmm. What types of initiative have you seen in communities that are combating and dealing with this issue?
I think my favorite comes from Nain, and it's Create a Good Day. And this comes from Dorothy Agnetalk, Duru. And she was a youth leader. She did a lot of great work in Nain. And she said, if you see someone who's not having a good day, then create a good day. And that's what I think the main message is. I think if you're hurting because of a death and you see other people hurting, you need to help them. And by helping them, you help yourself. And everybody feels better. That's how you heal.
Yeah. What are some potential things that we can do, other things besides, creating good days that we could do to help fix this issue and increase life expectancies?
Well, I'd say on the personal level, just embrace the awkward. Don't be afraid to reach out. Don't be afraid to look bad. If you don't know what to say, just say, I'm sorry, I don't know what to say, but I'm here. Offer people food. Don't wait for people to ask for help. That's going to help a lot on the personal level. On the larger societal levels, I think that we need more support for mental health. I think that we need to champion more positive role models to show that there are people out there doing good things, because I think a lot of people are feeling kind of hopeless. I just hope that with each year and with each generation of people that we can do better and be kinder and help each other more. And I just hope that trend continues.
As do I, I'm sure, as do all of us. Thank you so much for your time today.
All right, thank you.
That's Ozzy Michelin, an Inuk journalist based in Montreal. If you need some help or want somebody to talk to or need some resources, please check out a list on our website at cbc.ca/unreserved. And remember, you're never alone. We've been talking all throughout the show about how supporting Indigenous people to survive and thrive in their communities goes hand in hand with mental health supports. And that's something Frances Elizabeth Moore has been working on with We Matter, an outreach campaign for Indigenous youth in Canada. She tells us about her work, why it's important, and what she sees on the ground in communities.
So my name is Frances Elizabeth Moore, and I'm from Timiskaming First Nations in Quebec, although I live in London and have for 14 years now. I am the Operations and National Outreach Manager for We Matter. The We Matter campaign is an amazing social media campaign directed towards Indigenous youth to communicate with them that they matter, showing that positive representation that is grossly missing, and messages from our youth and videos created for those youth by different Indigenous role models, actors, actresses, musicians, politicians, and allies, sharing their own experiences of overcoming hardships and communicating with Indigenous youth that no matter how hopeless life can feel, there is always a way forward. With the We Matter campaign, we've reached millions of people on social media, and it continues to be an ever-growing library of positivity and hope. I'm thinking Manitou Rapids and Rainy River First Nation in particular. That particular community, I'm biased. I'm auntie to five of the kids that are in it, but they're ones that did a homework club. They started a youth council, and they've taken that money that we had provided them and really built upon it and programming. Their population, the majority of their youth population, if I remember correctly, falls between like 10 and 13. So there's not a whole lot of younger ones, and there's not a whole lot of older teens. So their programming really focused on that age group. One thing that this job has given me in the last 2 years that I didn't ever anticipate was hundreds of amazing youth that connect to me and call me auntie or mama bear, and they just send me messages. One earlier, I may have a thing about Baby Yoda, so one sent me a meme, another one tagged me in a meme. So like having those relationships with them has been just as beneficial for me as it has been for them. Like they have someone that they can come talk to, but also I gain so much love from just them. One of the most frustrating parts about the work that I do right now is actually the media leadership and political commentary about Indigenous youth suicide. When discussing Indigenous youth suicide, the majority of the articles are framed with this tone that everything is just so direlessly hopeless. And that creates a ripple of people at all levels believing that it actually is hopeless. And it's dire and deserves your attention and support, but there's ways that we can go about doing this that don't actually contribute to the issue, but instead uplifts those that are experiencing the crisis. So I ask you, when the youth only has that negative representation and they're bombarded with those messages, how do you think that it affects that they see themselves? One of the things that we frequently hear from the media leadership politician is the top-down approach of sending in counselors and how that will solve everything. And it makes me shake my head because it will absolutely help, and we absolutely do need those resources. However, we don't need to be professionals to be talking about mental health. We do, however, need to become more comfortable in normalizing having those conversations in a genuine and supportive way. We need to recognize that there are an immense amount of struggles that the youth face. But when all we focus on is those negative struggles, we lose sight of their strengths, resilience, and all the amazing Indigenous folks out there doing amazing things despite those struggles. Why is it important to build up Indigenous youth? Well, they're our future. I think that's the biggest part that we forget is they're going to take over. And I can't think of a better way to support them than to make sure that they have those tools to take over and make those decisions. You know, when I was my son's age, I was putting glue on my hands and peeling it off. And when he was around 11, you know, he was protesting his rights. My niece is 17 and she makes me cry all the time because she's far more intelligent than I was at 17. I think at 17 she's where I was in my 20s when I was in university or in college. So it's important to recognize that times have shifted. And as adults, our roles have shifted as well. Not only do we have the capacity to support youth, but we should just want to. We should want to be those adults that we needed when we were younger. The biggest way that we can help youth rise from despair is with hope, building that capacity, truly hearing and uplifting the youth so they feel a part of the process. No more decision-making in silos. They need to feel like they have some agency in this situation, and right now, they don't. There's far too many people talking for them or at them and not with them. So we can hold space for them and listen to youth voices. Better yet, we can make space for them at decision-making tables. We can share more positive content, even if it's just on our own feeds. We can challenge the media and our leadership and politicians on how they're framing the issues. You can always take on your problematic auntie or uncle. You can push for representation in arts, culture, and film, and support the amazing Indigenous talent that we have out there. There's so many folks that mainstream media just misses out on because they're not tapped into our cultures, really. And then, of course, you can advocate for those systemic and institutionalized changes while being mindful of balancing those messages with those of hope. There's just so much that we aren't doing that we could be doing to better these youth's lives. And to me, the We Matter campaign ultimately is hope. We share the happier aspects of Indigenous life and what it means to be Indigenous.
Frances Moore is the National Outreach Manager at We Matter. We spoke to her from London, Ontario. If you want to help organizations who help Indigenous communities experiencing crisis, visit our website, cbc.ca/unreserved, for an extensive list of resources. This episode was produced by Kyle Musica, Stephanie Cram, Zoe Tennant, and Anna Lazowski. If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at unreserved@cbc.ca or find us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm your favorite cousin, Rosanna Deerchild, coming at you from Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory. Thank you for listening to Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. Egosay.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.